So the really important part of this whole unit, as much as I would love to sit and talk to you guys for hours and hours and hours about how cool the Mongols were and how innovative Khan was and how he was, unlike, any military or, ruler of his time period. What's really important for you guys to take away from this unit in terms of the Mongols is how the Mongols changed the world. And the funny part about it it's not that the Mongols changed themselves. I mean, the Mongols do change. They are influenced very heavily by the people that they conquer. But the Mongols and the swiftness and the brutality and the ferocity with which they bring basically all of Asia under their control is again unheard of in human history, and it completely devastates some of the oldest civilizations in the world, and it completely devastates the mindset and the outlook of a lot of these civilizations, a lot of these major belief systems. Um, the impact of the Mongol invasions, shapes China for the next 400 years. It completely reverses the path that Islam had been on for, 300 years. And it's going to have a really, really massive impact on the direction of Europe, of the Middle East, of China, of basically anywhere that the Mongols touch. Um, so what we're going to talk about is we're going to look at what are the short-term effects of Mongol rule as well as what are the longer-term effects of Mongol. Now, in the short term, one of the things that the Mongols do is they help to revitalize Eurasian trade. Under the Mongols, because of the size and the security and the lack of threat to their empire, travel and trade during this period is basically the safest it's been since Roman time, since the time of the Romans on one end and the Han on the other. And this allows for not only a massive exchange of goods, but of people, of food, and most importantly, technology. And the most important of that is Chinese technology diffusing its way out of China along the Silk Road into the Western world. Okay. Especially the printing press and gunpowder. Like we're going to talk about two chapters or two units from now, the adoption of gunpowder weapons by the rest of the world, I mean, just completely revolutionizes everything. Groups that had been exploited minorities become massive empires. Continents that had been cultural backwaters for 1,000 years, like Europe, soon begin to dominate world trade and dominate entire other continents like the Americas. So gunpowder is, I mean, it's completely revolutionary. It changes the destinies of hundreds of millions of people. The printing press, especially its adoption in Europe, completely revolutionizes learning and education in those areas, like which we're going to talk about in the next chapter. And again, it helps feed Europe's rise and resurgence and their eventual domination of most of the rest of the world. Um, Now, this period of safety and security and trade and cultural diffusion becomes known as the Pax Mongolica. Again, this should sound familiar because remember we talked about the Pax Romana. Again, this would be great evidence if you ever get like an SAQ or an LEQ where you got to compare the two. Be excellent. The other really big, important short-term effect of the Mongols is the plague, what we know as the Black Death. So The Black Death is commonly known as the bubonic plague. It is carried by it is caused by a virus known as Yersinia pestis, generally carried by fleas. Those fleas usually travel on the backs of rats, dogs, cats, other animals, which they then infect as well. Um, so this iteration of the bubonic plague, because here's the thing, is bubonic plague wasn't something new. This didn't just pop up out of nowhere. The Chinese had been hit by bubonic plague before. Um, Arab and Persian civilizations had been hit by it before. Not so much in Europe, which is why it has such a devastating effect. Um, but this plague wasn't completely unknown. Um, what is devastating about this plague is how quickly it moves. And part of that is thanks to the resurgence of the trade routes under the Mongols because of the safety and security of the Pax Mongolica. This disease, this virus spreads much more rapidly and much more effectively than it ever had before. Another thing about it is, this iteration of the bubonic plague also mutates and becomes airborne, where in the past bubonic plague was again spread by infected animals or infected insects. When it makes its way into the Middle East and Southern Europe, the virus mutates and it becomes airborne. And now just simply, being in the presence of people who are coughing, who are spitting up, can get one infected. Um, Now, the Black Death is a truly transformational event, especially in the Christian world and especially in the Muslim world. In the Muslim world, the Black Death hits extremely hard. Major population centers in Arabia, Persia, and the Middle East generally see death rates of 30 to 40%, all in a matter of a few years. And as in the Christian world, in the Islamic world, this plague is seen by most people as a form of punishment from God. Now, the Muslim world is more technologically and scientifically advanced at this point in history, so they do tend to fare better because they pioneer new ways of quarantining victims and treating the disease. But they are unable to develop a cure. Like, we don't develop antivirals until the 21st century. Um, so it does hit the Islamic world hard, and that combined with the absolute destruction of the Abbasid Caliphate by the Mongols produces this kind of conservative backlash within Islam, where the leading scholars and the wealthy and the educated within the Islamic community begin to look at the plague. They begin to look at their conquering by the Mongols, and they begin to say, we're being punished, right? That this is godly punishment. And that leads to this very conservative movement within Islam over the next several centuries, where people push back against kind of the worldliness of the Islamic world. Science and literature and art is kind of blacklisted, and people are pushed to, move out of kind of secular pursuits and refocus themselves on strict interpretation and strict living under the Quran and Islam. So the Black Death combined with the Mongols is generally credited with kind of killing this Islamic golden age that you saw under the Abbasid Caliphate, and giving rise to these very conservative, very strict interpretations of Islam. Now, in Europe, in the Christian world, um, the Black Death hits, for the most part, even harder than it does in the Islamic world. And the Christian world goes through many of the same crises of faith that the Muslim world does. We'll talk in a couple of units about the Protestant Reformation and how the Black Death influenced that and how it creates this, second giant schism or crisis in Christianity. However, thanks to that separation of church and state that we've talked about quite a bit that exists in Christianity that doesn't exist within Islam, the conservative influences of religion, the conservative pushback, this idea that God is punishing us for straying too far from Him, doesn't really take hold as much as it does in the Islamic world. And in Europe and in the Christian world, the Black Death, once it passes and people are able to regain some semblance of normality in their lives, kind of has the opposite effect. The Black Death in Europe is credited with helping to begin this flourishing of European cultural society. It helps to begin, it contributes to the beginning of the Renaissance. It helps to break down medieval feudalism because labor is in such short supply that workers can now demand better wages, they can demand better living conditions, they can begin to break their feudal contracts, move off of their lord's lands. So, in the short term, um, the Black Death and Mongol rule has some pretty transformative effects. But its real impact comes in the long term, which we'll talk about on the next.